So I guess we're gonna have to move or something. He said he'd come back over. He checked his figures again for this summer, and it don't matter what happens, because it's always happening. Changes with the directions of the wind, or the rain, or the shine, or the moon, or the sun. Circles, circles. I see, I see. So what we're reading here is a correspondence between Manson family member and Charles Manson himself. Catherine Gillies, aka Capistrano, aka Silver, aka Silver Wings, aka Silver Caps, aka a dozen different names. We're getting back into the story of Cappy today, because we haven't finished reading her letters yet, and that was just a portion of some of the things she goes off to Manson about. Now it sounds like they're not able to pay their rent, and they're getting ready to get kicked out, which is pretty much normal when you follow the Manson family. House to house to house to house to house to house to house, all over the place. Let's get back into this letter of Capistrano, and welcome to the BPT, the only channel with the same initials as the Board of Prison Terms. Hello. Anyway, it's hard in the day, things happening with the landlord. The people at the magic shop are closing down and moving on, like we will be in a while. You know, that was one thing about Cappy, that if you follow her story, she's always looking for a place to live. That's her main concern, is where she's going to be living. That's it. Okay, what we're looking at here is Manson's drawing of the colors, of the girls' colors. You've heard a lot about this before. The whole gist of this colors thing, making all these girls colors. And one of the colors that's not listed on here is the color of rainbow, or rainbow, and that would be Barbara Rosenberg. And the whole meaning to all these colors is what was happening as all these people were in prison now, and Charlie was pretty much losing control of everybody. Susan was going off to be with Jesus, you know. Pat was having thoughts, Leslie was having thoughts, so it was a way to kind of bring them all back together, keep them all together as a group, cling on to that old feeling that they were trying to cling on to. And some of these girls weren't having it. Barbara Rosenberg, she was gone. She was gone so much she even divorced one of the members of the Manson family to get out of it, and then she moved on. But she was the rainbow, and then we'll look at who these other colors were. And we'll show you a close-up, but over here on one side of his line divide, he's got red, blue, and gold, orange, and silver. And like we already told you, Capistrano took on the name Silver. She was silver and she kept it forever. So she was one of the girls that clung on to this, you know. Yeah, Manson gave me a nickname, so I'm taking it. Red and blue, we already know who they are. And there are two others that clung on to the nicknames and saved them all their lives. And Charlie even goes into other colors like violet for Susie, yellow for Pat, blue for Sandra Good. The green was for Leslie and trees. And actually, if you look at this drawing, Manson even has symbols for these colors. And if you ever looked at Sandra Good's name, sometimes she'll even draw out the symbol that Manson gave her for her own name in her signature. We got red, which is Lynette, and Lynette also, Manson's little sign for L. Lynette, sometimes she uses that as well. We got gold for Nancy, and then we got a couple other little witchy things over here that don't have anything attachment to it. But that's the colors. Basically trying to keep the group together when the group really was saying, you know what, it's time to split up. We've played our last show. Here Manson puts some other pictures. Silver Caps, Mama Mary, the Gold Girl, the cat lady. I heard she had a lot of cats too, which is kind of funny. And last but not least, Baby B, blue queen of crystal. A blue crystal queen has powers. Well, we just got home. It's Saturday. C has to work tomorrow, so good dreams if there's any good places to play. Good morning. There are ways of seeing it. Using my mind. I see. It's foggy here. I think I'll end this. Not too much to say. I learned how to weave beads. Love for love, one is one. Capistrano. She almost wrote to him like it was a diary, you know? And then she would tell him later. She threw most of them away. It's labeled different things on this part of one of her letters. It says, children. Something my mother took from me, you gave back. You gave me a positive where there had only been a negative. Thank you, my love. Your gift to me. The earth, the world itself, matters more. The long-term effects are astronomical and too much to comprehend all at once. All life. I fell down on the job. What does she mean by I fell down on the job? Because we were talking about a time when she was supposed to go back and take care of her grandmother and take over the property at Myers. But was that actually Charlie's plan to go, for this girl to actually go eliminate her grandmother from the world just to take over the property? Or was it this girl's idea? And it was probably this girl's idea if we start looking at how they lived at the Barker Ranch property. Because it was said on the Barker Ranch property, they first went to Myers, and then from Myers, Manson said he didn't want to stay at Myers because he felt the ghost of Bill Myers there. And honestly, he thinks Bill Myers' ashes are there. And if you look around and you try to find Bill Myers' ashes anywhere, or his wife's for that matter, you won't find them. And they probably are there. So Manson was probably right. It probably does have an aura to it that might not feel right. So then they went over to Barker Ranch, and Helter Skelter, it makes it sound like, oh, they were found out, so then Manson tried to offer an album to stay there. But is that the story that came from the lady who actually owned Barker Ranch at the time? We'll look at that right now. Okay, did you know Mrs. Barker met up with Charles Manson on 3 separate occasions? Not just one where he gave her a gold album, but 3. And the last time, he made an offer to her to buy the ranch. And she accepted, as long as he could come up with the money. It's in this form by the CHP. Mrs. Barker, owner of Barker Ranch in Goler Wash, stated she first saw subject Charles Manson about 1.5 years ago when he came to her home in Indian Ranch to ask permission to camp for a while out of her property in Goler Wash. She thought he meant a short camping trip and gave her permission. On this occasion, subject Manson was quite clean, although his hair was long, and he was driving a vehicle described as a Volkswagen-type camper and accompanied by a female. She next saw him sometime last winter when he arrived at Indian Ranch and gave her a framed gold record of the type of recording studio presents to an artist when the record sales have surpassed $1 million. The record in question had been presented to a group called the Beach Boys by Capitol Records. Mrs. Barker was not sure why I had given her the record or what his connection with the group was, but subject Manson seemed to indicate he was the composer or arranger of one or more selections on the album. The last time Mrs. Barker saw subject Manson was 2 or 3 weeks ago when he approached her at Indian Ranch in regards to purchasing her property in Goler Wash. She told him if he came up with the cash, she would sell. So that album, that gold album that Manson gave to Kurt Barker, and the reason her name, they call her Kurt, is because her maiden name was Kirtland, and they just called her Kurt as a kid. So now you know. And I talked to her grandson out in Death Valley, and he filled me in on a lot of things. He also filled me in on that she eventually just got rid of the gold record. I think he said for a couple $100 or something like that. But can you imagine the 2020 gold record from the Beach Boys that sold $1 million? Manson actually was on that. And that thing would be worth more now. Wow, it'd be worth, I don't know how much it'd be worth, but it'd be worth a lot attaching Manson and the Beach Boys to a piece of rock and roll history like that. Oh man, be out of this world. And then Manson also was negotiating with her to buy that property. That could have been Manson Ranch. So here's the only picture that I've ever actually seen of Ma Barker, and this guy gave it to me. This guy was a miner out in Death Valley himself. He used to be out at the Ballarat, trading post with his son Rocky. This is George Novak, Rocky's dad. He's passed away since then, but he gave me this picture, and this is Ma Barker, and this is how you pronounce her her maiden name, Kirkland, and they called her Kirk. Okay, we're going to get back to Capistrano's mail to Manson here in 1 second, but that relationship between Manson and Kirk Barker doesn't sound, nowhere in it does she sound threatened. Manson sounds like he wants to buy the property. He might be stealing the money to get it, but he sounds like he's trying to be legit there. And then we have the story where Manson sends Capistrano off to murder her grandmother to take the property at Myers Ranch, which none of them's really living at. Doesn't make much sense. But it actually happened. She took off. She took off with a guy that's unnamed from the ranch, because after they took off to do that and they had a flat tire, supposedly had a flat tire, and Cappy came walking back, again, probably feeling like a failure in life because she couldn't secure a property. But I think that was all just a made-up story. I don't think anybody was off to kill anybody's grandmother. And what I learned from the Park Service, at that time, Barbara Myers, who was married to Bill Myers, who was already dead and probably buried over at that property, she was 60 years old at the time. And she was probably tougher than Capistrano, actually. Because what I learned from the Park Service is when she was 90 years old, she was back up at the property, and that was in 1990s or something. Yeah, Barbara Myers was still at that property, and she was in there in a wheelchair to boot. And she did an interview with a person from the Bureau of Land Management. He was surveying the land, and he got an interview from her. And I have that here. So let's look at some of the things she said there, which is it's cool to me to learn. About 1.5 miles up the road from the Lotus Mine headquarters, water from a spring called Sourdough flows through an old bathtub and down the road. It is the source of much needed water for the Lotus Mine and for at least one family of the desert. Bighorn sheep I discovered a few years back ago on my way to Death Valley via this fascinating back door. I asked Barbara Myers how Sourdough Springs acquired its name. She replied, "We named it." I asked who we were, and she said, "I, my husband, and Carl Mengel named it." She continued, "Carl liked to cook breakfast of sourdough pancakes and fried burrito liver." Just reading from the information that guy got that tape from Barbara, it's like 14 pages. It goes on to say things like they're the ones that actually even made a lot of those roads out there. Sourdough Springs Road. It says they just used an old beat up car and just winged it, to make some of these roads. Goler Wash, they extended that road because it sounded like that they had toll roads out there. people had made roads, and if you wanted to drive down them, you had to pay a toll. Well, Mangle owned mines out there, and his trucks, he didn't want to, so they started making their own roads. So the Myers family, they owned a gas station out there. There's a drink named after Bill Myers. It's called, I don't know, the Dust Storm, and it's made out of dark rum and sarsaparilla on the rocks. Barbara Myers eventually acquired from Carl Mangle, because they were good friends with each other. The Myerses and Carl Mangle, they called him Peg Leg because he only had one leg. One of his legs was a wooden leg. There is a monument to Carl Mangle in Death Valley, and it was built by the Myers family. And they even put Carl Mangle's peg leg on it. Somebody stole that. But it's full of history about the Myers family out there. And another interesting fact is when Carl Mangle died, he willed all his mines to the Myers family. And one of the mines was the Lotus mine. So actually the Myers family, Capistrano, who was working with the Manson family in this Lotus mine, her family owned it. It's amazing the history that was in that thing that nobody ever tells you about, because nobody ever really looks into things, because I guess they're not interested. But I was interested, so I looked. And now you know. Okay, we're going to start with reading this letter again, but you're going to have to read with me in some parts, because some words I don't really know what they are. I think this word might be Santa Claus. So just read along with me, and you'll probably get a better idea of what I'm talking about. I tried Santa Claus when I was 10. My mother told me never to eat the mushrooms that grew on the lawns, as most of them are toadstools, and a very small bite of them constituted extremely deadly poison. She also told me about oleanders and milkweed. Go, Mom! I was always in more trouble than the time before. 10 years active duty. I was terrified of my mother, and I was late again. You can't change time. So it was the bamboo stick and a swat for each minute. The Chinese use caning as punishment, and I can see how it worked on adults like it did me. 10 minutes late, and I never wanted to go home ever. I loved school because my mom wasn't there. They always told on me though, so the news of my behavior inevitably beat me home, literally and figuratively. I ate mushrooms off every lawn on the way home from school. They didn't even make me sick. My mom got to beat me anyway. By this time, I was certainly 30 minutes late. Then I looked more up about the toadstools, and I discovered the death was excruciating, ugly, and slow. I researched other ways and discovered they all included pain and a terrible loss of dignity, and ultimately you would end up dead. That was the feature that came home to me. I called it off as a bad idea and began to run away. A little here, a little there, of course, and lots of the bamboo stick. It started to become clear to me that my mother was actually going to kill me. So I stole $200 from a Chinese puzzle box, got on a plane to San Francisco, and never looked back. I went to North Beach, lived with the beatniks, as they, being outside the law themselves, were not likely to turn me in. Honor amongst thieves. You got to know your in-laws from your outlaws. I was almost 14, a precious Opie Taylor, more of an immature tomboy than a woman. People took care of me, kept me safe. It was much more of an innocent time. Acid rapidly became my way of life, and it remained so. So now she's in San Francisco, and she's not there with the flower children and flowers in your hair and that kind of stuff, because that isn't even invented yet. Now it's wartime protesters, it's poets, it's music festivals, art festivals, Joan Baez kind of stuff, you know? And then it quickly changes, and it moves to Los Angeles, and so does she right with it. She moves into an area of outskirts of Los Angeles. It's called Lancaster. They set up a little, I don't know, it was a community of these people who were all mainly a bunch of women, a few guys, and they would basically feed the girls, acid, give them a place to stay, and they'd show up to music events. And they would be the dancers in the crowd, and they would lure people in, and they would dance even during the bad songs, they said, That finally ended up in the Topanga Canyon area. And she was doing the same thing there with more famous people. That's where the Manson family shows up. That's where she runs into the Manson family. Okay, here's a map I drew of Topanga Canyon. And before Cappy ever met up with the Manson family, she met up with this guy. He was in a band called Buffalo Springfield. She became a somewhat of a groupie for the band. She was following them around like she was following the rest of the people around, and living with them. And she eventually would meet up with the Manson family right here. And as you can see, that's a big old wind in the road. And Jim Morrison made a song about that wind in the road where he's like, keep your hands on the wheel, your eyes on the road and your hands on the wheel. Because right in here, him and his girlfriend stayed in a place that was called the Roadhouse. Well, it wasn't called the Roadhouse, but that's what the song was called. This was called the Topanga Canyon Corral. Same difference, the Roadhouse. And just down the street from them was the guy from Canned Heat. He lived down there, and he actually died in the backyard. Neil Young, when he was on his own, he lived over here. This was after the Manson family. He recorded after the gold rush over here. And this is where Gary Hinman's house was. So there was all kinds. This is just the Topanga Canyon. There's other canyons, and Laurel Canyon had a lot of musicians on it. So all these people she's within range of already. Not to mention the people that are on the other canyon as well. So if you noticed the famous people I drew on my little Manson family map of Topanga Canyon, and why them? Because I actually think the Manson family knew all those people, as well as they knew the Monkees, the Beach Boys, everybody along that canyon that don't want to say they knew them. I find it funny that Capistrano was one of these girls that used to go hang out, she'd go hang out, they'd pay her an acid and rent and give her a place to stay. And that was also happening over at a house where one of the Monkees was at, Peter Tork, I believe, or where he was staying at. So the same thing that she's doing was happening there. And then later on, who was it? Mickey Dolenz. He comes out and he says, I fooled the press. Fooled the press? So basically you told him a damn lie. Anybody else would be, you lied to him. And there's two of the Monkees that came out and confessed of lying to the press. One of them was about how many albums they sold or how much money they'd made or something. And then he did it on purpose. And then Mickey Dolenz, I believe, comes out and says, yeah, we're the ones that I'm the one that made that up. And then he goes on to say that his roommate was, I believe, Stephen Stills, who was in Buffalo Springfield, who was hanging around Capistrano. Why would you even bring up the name Charles Manson? He tried out for the Monkees, unless you had some kind of association with Charles Manson. That's the funny part. Why would you even throw Manson's name in there as a joke? Or a lie, what I call it. And especially the Monkees made the damn lie up. Why? Because he wanted to get the fact out that I have an association with the Manson family too. I'm just not going to tell you what it is. It was this girl that we were having, feeding acid. I don't know. Stories all sound strange. They start to sound to connect when you really know the whole story. But anyway, let's get into more of her letters. Manson. Actually, that turned out to be a blessing because it was in San Quentin that I was introduced to the real Messiah, the Lord Jesus Christ, the Savior of sinners. B's taking a computer course. It's interesting. She wants me to take it. I may later. I help her study. Capistrano. In that, that was way later in the Manson family's life. That was well after Sandra Good had got out of jail. These people, Sandra, Lynette, and Capistrano, they pretty much stayed with Manson their entire lives, and still are. Some of them, 2 of them at least. And the bee that she was talking about there was Blue. She was now taking a computer class. And you know what she was going to do with that computer class? She was going to start the very first website about Charles Manson on the internet when the internet was brand new. Before anybody thought about anything to put on the internet, Sandra Good was taking a computer class to put Manson on the internet. ATWA.com, the very first site about Charles Manson ever. And most people would think it was George Simpson was the brains behind that, but he don't know much about computers, not even to this day. It was Sandra Good that actually was the brains behind ATWA.com. And Cappy was helping her with her studies. Well, at least we know all the harebrained ideas weren't Manson's. I don't think half of them were. But the one where they burned the loader out in Death Valley, she admitted during an interview that it was her idea. And the only thing that they really burned on it was the seat and wires. Because if you think about it, what can you really burn on those?
What happens is everybody gets scared. I mean, we got busted in the desert. There was a 988 tractor loader that was filling in the hot springs. And
government, yeah.
And I prompted let's do something to the 988. And it's really hard to do something to them because they're made out of metal. And so it took a long time, but we managed to burn the seat and some of the wiring. What made the government really mad, they found us. And then all the other stuff fell downhill from there.
There's always 2 different stories, actually. Actually, there's 20, 30, 40, 50, as many as you want. Stories never end. I find it, you know, Bullio's stories as compared to, say, my stories, they're way different. Bullio's in court is like, yeah, Manson ordered these girls to burn that thing. And if Manson could have stood up and spoke for himself, he'd have probably said something like, man, there's 40 women. You can't control 1 woman, let alone 40. They get something in their mind and they want to do it. You just sit there and let them do it, man. I didn't have anything to do with that. That was them. There's 40 of us here. How come I get the blame for everything? That's probably why they didn't let him up there. It would have been hilarious, though. It would have been the best theater. It would have been better than the OJ trial. Well, I'm running out of time here. And so I'm going to call it quits, because this takes a whole lot of time down here in this garage, and I don't know what's going on. The world could have ended out there. I need to go out and look. So, until next time, we come back and we creepy crawl through all kinds of stuff. As you can see, we got tons of things to look through. So, until next time, peace.
Why do they fear seeing me? It's God themselves, I know you see. Oh love, I love, look at your love. Oh love, I love, look at your